Sometimes the richest man in the county can feel like the poorest when he's raising 2 children alone. When your wife dies young and leaves you with 10-year-old twins who need a mother's love, all the cattle and land in the world can't fill that empty chair at the dinner table. Silas Boone knew this pain well. He owned more acres than most men could dream of, but he was tired of women who saw his fortune before they saw his heart. So he did something desperate. He left his ranch behind, put on worn clothes, and took his twins to a small town where nobody knew his name. He told everyone he was just a broke ranch hand looking for work. All he wanted was to find a woman who would love Daisy and Eli for who they were, not what they might inherit. But what happens when she learns the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Boone Ranch as Silas stood on his wraparound porch, watching his foreman Miguel direct the cattle toward the southern pasture. 20,000 head of prime beef cattle grazed on land that stretched from the foothills to the River Valley Empire, built over 2 decades of careful planning and backbreaking work. The Big Sky Ranch was everything a man could want. Yet Silas felt nothing but emptiness as he fingered the delicate gold chain around his neck. Hidden beneath his work shirt hung Sarah's wedding ring, the same one he'd placed on her finger 15 years ago under the old oak tree by the creek. She'd worn it through their courtship, their wedding, the birth of the twins, and right up until the fever took her 3 winters past. Now it rested against his heart, a constant reminder of what he'd lost and what his children needed. "Papa, are you really going to do this?" 10-year-old Daisy appeared beside him, her auburn curls catching the light exactly the way her mother's used to. She had Sarah's green eyes too, bright and questioning, always seeing straight through to the truth of things. "Do what, sweetheart?" Silas asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. The children had heard him talking to Miguel about taking time away from the ranch. "Leave all this behind and pretend to be poor." Daisy gestured toward the sprawling ranch with its well-maintained barns, the big house with its wraparound porch, and the distant mountains that served as a natural boundary to their property. "Mama always said honesty was the most important thing." Silas knelt down to meet her eyes, his weathered hands gentle on her small shoulders. "Your mama was right about that, and I'm not proud of what I'm planning. But Daisy, every woman who's come calling since Mama died has seen dollar signs before she's seen you and Eli. They ask about the ranch, about my business, about how much land we own. Not one has asked what your favorite story is, or whether Eli still has nightmares about losing his mama." Eli emerged from the barn carrying a hand-carved wooden horse that Silas had made for him the previous winter. The boy was quieter than his sister, more thoughtful, but his attachment to that little horse showed how much he craved his father's attention and love. "I heard Mrs. Patterson tell her friend that marrying you would set her up for life," Eli said softly. "She didn't know I was listening." The memory made Silas's jaw tighten. Victoria Patterson had been the most recent in a long line of women who'd made their intentions clear. She'd arrived with expensive perfume and a store-bought cake, spent the entire visit calculating the value of their furnishings, and barely acknowledged the children except to comment on how a firm hand would shape them up properly. "That's exactly why we're doing this," Silas said, pulling both children close. "I want to find someone who'll love you for who you are, not what you'll inherit someday. Someone who'll read bedtime stories and tend scraped knees and help with arithmetic homework." "But Papa," Daisy pressed, "won't she be upset when she finds out the truth? Won't she feel tricked?" The question cut deep because Silas had wrestled with it every night for weeks. Sarah would have had strong words about deception, even with good intentions. But Sarah had never had to watch their children's faces fall when another gold digger dismissed them as inconveniences to be managed. "I hope she'll understand that everything I did was for you two," he said finally. "And if she can't forgive me for protecting my children, then she's not the right woman for our family." Miguel approached from the direction of the corral, his hat in his weathered hands. He'd been with the ranch since before the twins were born, and Silas trusted him like a brother. "Patron, are you certain about this plan? The spring roundup is coming, and the new contracts with the railroad need your signature." "You can handle the roundup better than I can," Silas replied, standing and brushing dust from his knees. "And I'll be back for the important business decisions. This isn't about abandoning the ranch, Miguel. It's about finding my children a mother who'll cherish them." The older man nodded slowly. "Your Sarah, she would want the little ones to have a mama's love, but she would also want honesty, no?" "She would," Silas admitted, "but she'd want their happiness more." That evening, Silas helped the twins pack a single worn carpet bag each, choosing their oldest clothes and most modest belongings. He tucked away his fine leather boots in favor of scuffed work boots, traded his silver buckle for plain leather, and selected shirts that had seen better days. In his own bag, he placed only the essentials and, hidden in a secret compartment, enough money to see them through several months of simple living. "What name will you use, Papa?" Eli asked as they finished packing. "Sam Turner," Silas replied. "And you'll be Daisy and Eli Turner, remember? We're from a small ranch up north that went under after a harsh winter. I'm looking for steady work, and we're hoping to start fresh." Daisy practiced the story under her breath, but Silas could see the uncertainty in her eyes. These children had never known want or hardship, had never had to pretend to be anything other than exactly who they were. He was asking them to live a lie, and the weight of that responsibility settled heavy on his shoulders. The next morning, they loaded their meager belongings into an old wagonone of the work vehicles, rather than the fine carriage that usually carried the family. Miguel hitched up two sturdy but unremarkable horses, and the small party prepared to leave everything familiar behind. "How will you know when you've found the right woman?" Miguel asked as Silas climbed onto the wagon seat. Silas looked back at his children, who were trying to be brave despite leaving the only home they'd ever known. "She'll see them first," he said quietly. "Before she sees me, before she wonders about my circumstances, she'll see two children who need kindness and care, and she'll give it freely, without calculation or condition. And if no such woman exists in this world, then we'll come home and make do with what we have," Silas replied, though his heart ached at the thought. "But I have to try. For them, I have to try." As the wagon rolled down the long drive away from the Big Sky Ranch, Silas touched the ring beneath his shirt one more time. "Guide me, Sarah," he whispered. "Help me find someone who loved them the way you did." The twins sat quietly in the back of the wagon, watching their world disappear behind them. Daisy clutched a small cloth doll that Sarah had made for her, while Eli held tight to his wooden horse. They were leaving behind luxury and security, but they were traveling towards something potentially more precious, chance at the kind of love that couldn't be bought or bartered for. Millbrook was 2 days' ride to the east, a small frontier town that survived on farming, a bit of mining, and the occasional cattle drive passing through. Silas had chosen it precisely because it was unremarkable, the kind of place where a man could start over without too many questions asked. It was small enough that any woman willing to take in a stranger and 2 children would do so out of genuine kindness, not calculated advantage. As they made camp that first night under the stars, Eli asked, "Papa, what if we like her but she doesn't like us?" "Then we'll keep looking," Silas assured him, banking the small fire. "Somewhere out there is a woman with room in her heart for 2 good children, and maybe even their foolish father. We just have to find her." Daisy rolled closer to her brother in their shared bedroll. "Do you think Mama would approve of what we're doing?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Finally, he said, "Your Mama's greatest fear was that something would happen to her and leave you too, without the love and care you deserved. I think she'd understand that sometimes we have to take difficult paths to protect the people we love most." The second day brought them to the outskirts of Millbrook, just as the sun was setting. The town was exactly what Silas had hoped, for modest buildings, hard-working people finishing their daily tasks, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other and strangers were noticed, but not necessarily unwelcome. They drove slowly down the main street, taking in the general store, the blacksmith shop, the small church with its simple steeple, and various other businesses that served the local community. Near the end of the street, Silas noticed a sign hanging from a neat building. C. Mayfield, Seamstress and Alterations. Light glowed warmly from the windows, and through the glass they could see a woman bent over her work, her needle moving with practiced precision. Something about the scene, the quiet industry, the welcoming glow of lamplight, the sense of a woman making her own way in the world drew Silas's attention. "That one," Daisy said suddenly, pointing toward the seamstress shop. "She looks kind." Eli nodded agreement. "And she's working late, so she must care about doing good work." Silas studied the building more carefully. It was well maintained but not fancy, with flower boxes under the windows and a small sign advertising fair prices and quality workmanship. The woman inside moved with the confidence of someone skilled at her trade, and there was something in her posture that spoke of both strength and gentleness. "All right then," Silas said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the shop. "Let's see if Mrs. C. Mayfield has room in her life for 3 weary travelers." As he helped the children down from the wagon, Silas felt his heart racing. This was the moment of truth, the beginning of either the most important deception of his life, or the first step toward the happiness his family desperately needed. He touched Sarah's ring one more time, whispered a prayer for guidance, and walked toward the door that might change everything. The bell above the door chimed softly as Silas pushed into the seamstress shop, his children close behind him. The woman at the workbench looked up from her sewing, and Silas felt his breath catch. She was perhaps 45, with warm brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent hazel eyes that immediately focused not on him, but on Daisy and Eli. "My goodness," she said, setting down her needle and rising from her chair. "You 3 look half frozen. Come in properly." Cora Mayfield moved toward them with immediate concern, her hands already reaching for a patchwork quilt that hung over a nearby chair. The quilt was clearly her own work-intricate stitching in warm blues and yellows that spoke of countless evening hours spent creating something beautiful from scraps. Without hesitation, she wrapped it around both children, pulling them closer to the small pot-bellied stove that warmed the shop. "There now," she murmured, her voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to caring for others. "That's better. You're shivering like leaves in a storm." Silas watched in amazement as Cora knelt to the children's level, her attention completely focused on their comfort. She didn't glance at his clothes to assess his worth, didn't ask where they'd come from or where they were headed. She simply saw 2 cold children and acted to warm them. "I'm Sam Turner," Silas said, removing his worn hat. "These are my children, Daisy and Eli. We've been traveling all day, and I was hoping you might know of a place where we could find lodging for the night." Cora looked up at him then, and he was struck by the directness of her gaze. There was kindness there, but also the wariness of a woman who'd learned to be careful with strangers. "I'm Cora Mayfield. The boarding house is just down the street, but Mrs. Henderson doesn't much care for children, I'm afraid. Says they're too noisy." "We're very quiet," Eli said solemnly, his small hand clutching the wooden horse. "Papa taught us to be respectful in other people's houses." Cora's expression softened at the boy's earnest tone. "I'm sure you are, sweetheart, but some folks don't have much patience for little ones, even well-behaved ones." Silas felt his heart sink. If the only lodging in town didn't welcome children, they'd have to move on to the next settlement, and the twins were already exhausted from 2 days of travel. "There is another option," Cora said slowly, glancing around her shop as if weighing a decision. "I have a small apartment above the shop, just 2 rooms, but there's a decent bed and a sitting area with a sofa. I don't usually rent it out, but—" She looked down at the children again, and Silas saw her resolve solidify. "It's been empty since my last boarder moved on, and it seems foolish to leave it sitting vacant when there are children who need a warm place to sleep." "We couldn't impose on your kindness, ma'am," Silas said, though hope flared in his chest. "We don't have much money for rent." "Nonsense," Cora replied briskly. "A meal and a safe place to sleep shouldn't be luxuries. Besides, you look like a man who knows his way around tools. I've been meaning to fix that loose board on my front steps for weeks, and the door to the back room sticks something fierce." Daisy stepped forward, still wrapped in the quilt. "My papa can fix anything. He made Eli's horse all by himself, and it's the most beautiful horse in the whole world." Eli nodded enthusiastically, holding up the carved toy. "See? He made the mane so it looks like it's flowing in the wind, and the legs are positioned just right for galloping." Cora took the horse gently, turning it over in her hands with the appreciation of someone who understood craftsmanship. "This is remarkable work," she said, looking up at Silas with new interest. "The detail in the carving, the way you've captured the spirit of the animal, you have real skill." Silas felt heat rise in his cheeks. It had been a long time since someone had praised his work without knowing his wealth. On the ranch, people complimented his business acumen or his land management, but this simple appreciation for something he'd made with his own hands felt more genuine than anything he'd heard in years. "It was just something to keep my hands busy during the long winter evenings," he said modestly. "Just something," Cora repeated with a gentle smile. "Mr. Turner, this is the work of someone who understands both wood and love. Your son will treasure this always." She handed the horse back to Eli, who beamed at her words. Then she turned to Daisy, noticing how the girl held herself with unusual poise for a 10-year-old. "And what about you, miss? What brings you joy?" "I like to read," Daisy said shyly. "And I help Papa with the horses well. I used to help with the horses before we had to leave our old place." Cora's expression grew compassionate. "Hard times have been visiting a lot of good families lately. Lost your land, did you?" Silas nodded, hating the ease with which the lie came. "Harsh winter, then the bank called in the loan. Sometimes a man can work his whole life and still lose everything to forces beyond his control." "I understand something about that," Cora said quietly, and Silas caught a shadow of old pain in her eyes. "Well then, it's settled. You'll stay upstairs, and Mr. Turner can help me with some of these repairs I've been putting off. It'll be a fair trade." She moved toward the back of the shop, gesturing for them to follow. "Let me show you up to the apartment. It's not fancy, but it's clean and warm." The narrow staircase led to a cozy space that was exactly as she'd described. 2 modest rooms with worn but comfortable furniture. The main room held a small table, 2 chairs, and a sofa that could serve as a bed. The second room contained a proper bed with a quilt similar to the one she'd wrapped around the children. "The kitchen facilities are basic," Cora explained, indicating a small stove and a cupboard. "But there's a good well out back for water, and the privy is clean and private." "This is wonderful," Silas said, and he meant it. The apartment was simple but welcoming, the kind of place where a family could feel safe and cared for. "We're grateful for your kindness, Mrs. Mayfield." "Miss Mayfield," she corrected gently. "I'm a widow, and kindness shared is kindness multiplied," my mother always said. The children explored the small space with the enthusiasm of young ones who'd found an unexpected adventure. Daisy discovered a shelf of books in the sitting room and let out a delighted gasp. Eli found a window that looked out over the main street and reported on the evening activities below. "Now then," Cora said, "I imagine you're all hungry after your long day of travel. I was just about to prepare my own supper, and it's easy enough to make extra. Nothing fancy, just beef stew and fresh bread, but it's filling and warm." "You've already done too much," Silas protested, but Cora waved away his objections. "It's no trouble at all. Besides, I don't often have the pleasure of company for meals. It gets lonely, eating by yourself every night." As she headed back downstairs to prepare the meal, Silas felt a mixture of hope and guilt wash over him. Cora Mayfield was exactly what he'd hoped to find: kind, practical, generous, and clearly drawn to his children. But she was also trusting him with her hospitality based on a story that wasn't true. "Papa," Daisy whispered, settling onto the sofa with one of the books from the shelf. "I like her. She talks to us like we're real people, not just children to be managed." "She has sad eyes, though," Eli observed from his perch by the window. "Like she understands about missing someone." Both children had inherited their mother's perceptiveness, and their instinctive reading of Cora's character only confirmed what Silas already suspected: this woman had known loss and learned compassion from it. The question was whether that compassion would extend to forgiveness when she inevitably learned the truth about who they really were. The smell of cooking stew drifted up from below, warm and inviting. For the first time in months, Silas allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to come home each evening to such warmth, to share meals and conversation with someone who genuinely cared about his children's well-being. But underneath the hope lay a growing certainty that this deception, however well-intentioned, would extract a price. The only question was whether that price would be his alone to pay, or whether it would cost his children the very thing he was trying to find for them. 3 days had passed since their arrival in Millbrook, and Silas found himself settling into a rhythm that felt both natural and deeply unsettling. Each morning, he woke to the sound of Cora moving about her shop below, the gentle hum of her sewing machine providing a comforting backdrop to the children's whispered conversations as they dressed for the day. He'd already repaired the loose board on her front steps and fixed the stubborn door, but Cora seemed to find an endless supply of small tasks that needed a man's attention. The window in her workroom needed new putty, the shelving required reinforcement, and the shop sign had been hanging crooked for months. Silas approached each job with the thoroughness that had made him successful in ranching, though he was careful to work at the pace of a man grateful for employment rather than one accustomed to commanding others. This morning, he was replacing worn hinges on Cora's supply cabinet while she worked at her sewing table. The children sat nearby, Daisy reading aloud from a book of fairy tales, while Eli whittled a small piece of wood with a knife Silas had found among Cora's tools. "That's quite a story," Cora commented as Daisy finished reading about a princess who disguised herself as a commoner. "Do you think the prince was right to be angry when he discovered her deception?" Daisy considered the question seriously, unaware of how it made her father's hands still on his work. "I think he was hurt because she didn't trust him with the truth. But I also think she was scared that he wouldn't love the real her." "A wise observation," Cora said, glancing meaningfully at Silas before returning to her stitching. "Sometimes people make choices out of fear that end up causing the very pain they were trying to avoid." Silas felt the weight of her words, though he couldn't tell if she was speaking generally or if she'd begun to suspect something about his own circumstances. He'd been careful to maintain his story, but these children of his were accustomed to honesty, and small inconsistencies had a way of slipping through. "Miss Cora," Eli said, looking up from his whittling, "why did you become a seamstress?" Cora's needle paused for just a moment. "Well, I learned to sew from my mother when I was about your age. She said every woman should know how to mend and make, that it was a skill that would serve me well, no matter what life brought." "But you're really good at it," Daisy observed. "Papa says when someone's really good at something, it means they love doing it." "Your papa is a wise man," Cora replied, smiling at Silas over the children's heads. "Yes, I do love it. There's something satisfying about taking separate pieces of fabric and turning them into something useful and beautiful. Like this quilt I'm working, one each square tells a story, but together they make something larger than any single piece could be alone." Silas watched her hands as she spoke, noting the confidence in her movements, the way she handled the delicate fabrics with both skill and care. In her leather-bound journal, which lay open beside her work, he could see neat handwriting covering the pages. She glanced at it occasionally, as if checking notes or recording thoughts about her current projects. "What do you write in your journal?" Daisy asked, having noticed the same thing. Cora looked slightly embarrassed. "Oh, it's just my way of remembering things. I write down what fabrics work well together, notes about customers' preferences, ideas for new patterns. Sometimes I write down thoughts about the day, or things that strike me as worth remembering." "Like what?" Eli pressed, his natural curiosity making him bolder than usual. "Well," Cora said, closing the journal gently, "yesterday I wrote about how your father's hands show he's done more than just ranch work. The calluses tell a story of varied laborno, just rope and leather, but tools and fine work. And I noted How you both speak with better grammar than most children your age, as if someone took great care with your education." Silas felt his chest tighten. Cora was more observant than he'd given her credit for, and her gentle probing suggested she was piecing together details that didn't quite fit the story he'd told. "Papa reads to us every night," Daisy said proudly, unknowingly providing a partial explanation. "He says education is the one thing no one can ever take away from you." "Very true," Cora agreed. "And what did you read last night?" "We're working through Robinson Crusoe," Silas said, grateful for a truthful answer, "though I have to admit, some of the language is challenging for bedtime reading." "I have a copy of that very book upstairs," Cora said. "First edition, actually. It belonged to my late husband. He was quite fond of adventure stories." The mention of her husband was the first personal detail she'd shared, and Silas found himself curious about the man who'd won this remarkable woman's heart. There was a sadness in her eyes when she spoke of him, but also a warmth that suggested their marriage had been a happy one. "What happened to him?" Eli asked, with the directness of childhood, before either adult could redirect the conversation. "Eli," Silas warned gently. "That's a personal question." "It's all right," Cora said, though her voice grew softer. "He died in a mining accident 4 years ago. There was a cave in at the copper mine outside of town. 7 men lost their lives that day." The simple, matter-of-fact way she shared this tragedy spoke of grief that had been processed and integrated, not overcome but accepted. Silas recognized the tone. It was the same way he spoke of Sarah's death when pressed for details. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "It's hard to rebuild a life after losing someone you love." Their eyes met across the workroom, and in that moment, Silas felt a connection that went beyond their careful words. Here was another person who understood the weight of loss, the challenge of moving forward while honoring the past. "Thank you," Cora said simply, "and I'm sorry for whatever loss brought you and the children to this place. It's clear you've all known hard times." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the shop door. Through the window, Silas could see a well-dressed woman carrying a bundle of fabric. "That's Mrs. Patterson," Cora said, rising to answer the door. "She's probably here about the dress I'm altering for her daughter's wedding." As Cora moved to greet her customer, Silas felt his blood run cold. Victoria Patterson, the same woman who'd pursued him so aggressively back at the ranch. If she recognized him, their entire deception would crumble in an instant. "Children," he said quietly, "why don't you take your things upstairs for a few minutes? I think Miss Cora needs some privacy with her customer." But as Mrs. Patterson entered the shop, her sharp eyes immediately scanned the room, taking in every detail. Her gaze lingered on Silas for a moment too long, and he saw the flicker of confusion cross her features, as if she almost recognized him but couldn't quite place where they'd met. "I wasn't aware you had taken in boarders, Miss Mayfield," Mrs. Patterson said coolly, her tone carrying the subtle disapproval of someone accustomed to having her opinions matter. "Just temporarily helping some folks who needed a place to stay," Cora replied diplomatically. "Mr. Turner has been kind enough to help with some repairs around the shop." Mrs. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied Silas more closely. "Turner, you said. That name sounds familiar somehow." Silas forced himself to remain calm, continuing his work on the cabinet hinges as if the conversation didn't concern him. But inside, his heart was racing. If Victoria Patterson recognized him, it wouldn't just expose his deception, it would reveal him as one of the wealthiest men in the territory, making Cora look like either a fool or a conspirator. The fragile trust he'd been building with this remarkable woman hung in the balance, and there was nothing he could do but wait and hope that his disguise would hold. Mrs. Patterson's scrutiny felt like a physical weight pressing down on Silas as he continued working on the cabinet, forcing his hands to remain steady despite the tension coursing through his body. He could hear her discussing alterations with Cora, but her attention kept drifting back to him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You know, Mr. Turner," she said suddenly, "you remind me of someone I met recently. A cattleman from up north, very successful, quite wealthy. The resemblance is really quite striking." Silas looked up from his work, meeting her gaze with what he hoped was polite confusion. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know about that, ma'am. Never had much dealings with wealthy folks. Just trying to make an honest living, fixing what needs fixing." Mrs. Patterson murmured, clearly not entirely convinced. "Well, perhaps it's just one of those coincidences, though I must say your children are remarkably well spoken for. For children whose father works with his hands." Cora interjected smoothly, though there was steel beneath her polite tone. "I found that good manners and proper speech have more to do with a parent's care than their bank account." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose at the subtle rebuke. "Of course, Miss Mayfield, I simply meant that education can be expensive and Papa taught us himself," Daisy said from the stairway, where she'd apparently been listening despite instructions to go upstairs. "He says learning is the most important gift a parent can give their children." Silas felt a surge of pride at his daughter's words, even as he worried about what other revelations might slip out. The children had been raised with the expectation that their education mattered, that their thoughts and opinions were valuable. It was difficult for them to suddenly pretend otherwise. "How admirable," Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone suggested she found it anything but. "And where exactly did you receive your own education, Mr. Turner? You speak quite well for a working man," Silas supplied, allowing a hint of challenge to enter his voice. "My mother was a schoolteacher, ma'am. She made sure I knew my letters and numbers, and I've tried to pass that same gift along to my children." It was a plausible explanation, and mostly true. His mother had indeed been educated, though she'd married into ranching rather than teaching. Mrs. Patterson seemed to accept it, though her eyes remained suspicious. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose I should collect my altered dress and be on my way. Miss Mayfield, I trust it will be ready by Thursday, as promised." "Of course," Cora replied, moving toward the back room where the finished garments hung. The hemline adjustments came out beautifully. As Cora retrieved the dress, Mrs. Patterson took one final, lingering look at Silas. "You know, Mr. Turner, if you're looking for steady work, my husband owns the largest dry goods store in the county. He's always in need of reliable men for loading and transport." "I appreciate the thought, ma'am, but I'm content with the arrangement I have here," Silas replied carefully. "Miss Mayfield has been more than generous." After Mrs. Patterson finally departed, the tension in the room seemed to dissipate like smoke. Cora closed the door behind her customer and leaned against it for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "That woman has always been too curious for her own good," she said finally, "and too quick to judge people by their circumstances rather than their character." "She seemed to think she knew me from somewhere," Silas said, testing the waters to see how much Cora had noticed. "Victoria Patterson thinks she knows everyone worth knowing," Cora replied with a slight smile. "She's also convinced that anyone with good manners must be putting on airs above their station. Don't let her bother you." The dismissive tone in Cora's voice suggested she hadn't taken Mrs. Patterson's suspicions seriously, which was both a relief and a source of guilt for Silas. Here was this wonderful woman defending him against accusations that were, in essence, completely accurate. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Silas found himself alone with Cora in her workroom. She was adding entries to her leather-bound journal, the lamplight casting a warm glow over her features as she wrote. He'd offered to help clean up after their simple supper, and she'd accepted gratefully. "What are you writing about tonight?" he asked, hanging up the dish towel after drying the last plate. Cora looked up from her journal, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Observations, mostly. Thoughts about the day. Anything interesting?" She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "I was writing about how Daisy helped Eli with his reading today, the way she corrected his pronunciation so gently, and how you carved him a new wooden figure while he practiced a little rabbit to go with his horse. You did it without him even asking, just because you noticed he was struggling with the lesson." Silas felt warmth spread through his chest at her words. It seemed like he needed encouragement. Most fathers would have told him to work harder or practice more. You saw that he needed a small joy to balance the difficulty. Cora closed the journal and looked at him directly. "That's the mark of a man who understands children's hearts." The sincerity in her voice made Silas's throat tight with emotion. How long had it been since someone had seen and appreciated his efforts as a father? The women who'd pursued him at the ranch had viewed the children as obstacles to overcome, not treasures to be cherished. "They're good children," he said simply. "They deserve patience and kindness." "Yes, they do," Cora agreed, "and they're lucky to have a father who understands that." As she spoke, she pulled something from a drawer in her work tabler silver locket on a delicate chain. She opened it to reveal a small photograph of a man with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "This was my husband, James," she said softly. "He had the same way with children, though we never had any of our own. He used to say that a child's confidence was like a tender plant, needed protection and nurturing to grow strong." Silas studied the photograph, seeing the love in the man's face even captured in the still image. "He looks like he was a good man." "He was," Cora said, closing the locket carefully. "Kind, patient, generous to a fault. Sometimes I think that's why I was drawn to help you, and the children you remind me of him in some ways." The comparison should have pleased Silas, but instead it made his deception feel even more wrong. This woman was comparing him to her beloved, late husband, based on qualities she saw in him, but those qualities were shadowed by the fundamental dishonesty of his presence in her life. "Cora," he began, then stopped, unsure how to voice the growing weight of his guilt. "Yes? I want you to know that these past few days shaving a place where the children feel safe and welcomed it means more than I can express." She smiled, and the warmth in her expression nearly undid him. "They feel like family already, Sam. All three of you do." Family. The word hung between them like a promise and a threat. It was exactly what Silas had hoped to hear, but it also raised the stakes of his deception to a level that made his chest ache with anxiety. Later that night, as he lay on the narrow sofa listening to his children's quiet breathing from the next room, Silas fingered Sarah's ring beneath his shirt and wondered if he was building something beautiful or walking toward a disaster that would hurt everyone he was trying to protect. 2 weeks had passed since their arrival in Millbrook, and Silas found himself caught between two worlds in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each morning brought telegrams from Miguel at the ranch updates on cattle prices, questions about spring contracts, reminders of the responsibilities waiting for him back home. He collected them at the telegraph office before dawn, when the town was still quiet and no one would see him receiving correspondence that might raise questions about a simple ranch hand's business affairs. This particular morning, the telegram in his pocket felt heavier than usual. A dispute with neighboring ranchers over water rights required his immediate attention, and there were legal documents that needed his signature before the week's end. He tucked the yellow paper deep into his jacket and walked slowly back toward Cora's shop, trying to figure out how to explain another absence. "You're up early," Cora observed, as he slipped in through the back entrance. She was already at her workbench, stitching delicate trim onto what looked like a wedding dress. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the gold threads in the fabric, making them shimmer like captured sunlight. "Couldn't sleep," he said, which was true enough. "Thought I'd get an early start on that shelving repair you mentioned." Cora looked up from her work, studying his face with those perceptive hazel eyes. "Is everything all right, Sam? You've seemed distracted lately, worried about something." The concern in her voice made his chest tighten with guilt. She'd grown to know him well enough to read his moods, to sense when something was troubling him. It was the kind of attention he'd craved during the lonely months after Sarah's death, but now it felt like a spotlight, illuminating his deception. "Just thinking about the future," he said carefully. "About what comes next for me and the children." "Well, you don't need to worry about that right away," Cora said, returning to her stitching. "You're welcome here as long as you need to stay. The children are thriving, and you've been such a help with all these repairs. Honestly, I don't know how I managed without you." The casual domesticity of the Momentha bent over her work, while he prepared to fix something in her home felt both wonderful and terrible. This was exactly the kind of life he'd dreamed of, but it was built on foundations that would crumble the moment she learned the truth. "Miss Cora." Daisy's voice called from upstairs, followed by the sound of feet on the narrow staircase. Can you help me with my arithmetic? Papa's good at most subjects, but numbers make him grumpy. Numbers don't make me grumpy. Silas protested as his daughter appeared in the workroom, her slate and chalk in hand. I just think there are more interesting things to study than long division. Like what? Eli asked, joining his sister with his own schoolwork. Like the stories people tell through their craftsmanship, Silas said, gesturing toward Cora's intricate needlework. Or the way different woods respond to carving. Mathematics is useful, but it doesn't feed the soul the way art does. Cora smiled at his words, spoken like a true craftsman. Though I have to say, mathematics has its own beauty when you're calculating fabric requirements or working out the proportions for a quilt pattern. As she moved to help Daisy with her numbers, Silas noticed how naturally she'd stepped into a maternal role with his children. She praised their efforts, patiently explained difficult concepts, and celebrated their small victories with genuine enthusiasm. Watching her, he could almost forget the complications of his situation and simply enjoy the sight of his family, for that's what they'd become working together in the morning light. The peaceful moment was interrupted by a sharp knock at the front door. Through the window, Silas could see a well-dressed man in a fine coat and polished boots, clearly someone of means and authority. His stomach dropped as he recognized the bearing of someone from his own social circle. "I'll get it," Cora said, setting down Daisy's slate. "You children continue with your lessons." Silas busied himself with the shelving repair, but he strained to hear the conversation at the front of the shop. The visitor's voice was cultured and confident, the tone of a man accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Miss Mayfield, I'm Dr. Harrison Wells from the county seat. I've heard wonderful things about your needlework, and I find myself in need of your services." "Of course, Dr. Wells. What can I do for you?" "I'm recently widowed, and I'm looking for someone to help me update my household new curtains, perhaps some decorative work. More importantly, I'm seeking the companionship of a refined woman who might appreciate the security and comfort I can provide." Silas's hands stilled on the wood he was sanding. The man was courting Cora, and doing so with the kind of straightforward approach that spoke of confidence in his own worth. Unlike Silas, Dr. Wells had no need for deception. His credentials and wealth were undoubtedly genuine and verifiable. "That's very flattering, Dr. Wells," Cora replied carefully, "but I'm quite content with my current circumstances." "Are you certain? I understand you have some temporary boarders. Surely a woman of your obvious refinement would prefer a more stable arrangement. I can offer you a fine home, social standing, and freedom from the necessity of taking in charity cases." The dismissive way he referred to Silas and the children as charity cases made Silas's jaw clench. But it was Cora's response that truly mattered. "Dr. Wells, I appreciate your offer, but those charity cases are good people who needed help. Kindness isn't charity, it's humanity. And I find more satisfaction in my current life than I would in any arrangement that required me to abandon my principles." "I see," Dr. Wells said, his tone cooling slightly. "Well, perhaps when your current situation resolves itself, you'll reconsider. I'll be in town for several days if you change your mind." After he left, Cora returned to the workroom with a slight frown creasing her brow. Silas pretended to be absorbed in his work, but he could feel her studying him. "Everything all right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "That was Dr. Wells, a successful physician from the county seat. He's looking for a wife. And he seemed to think I should be interested in his proposal simply because he's wealthy and prominent." Cora picked up her needlework again, but her movements were more forceful than usual. As if the most important thing about a man is what he can buy rather than who he is. Silas felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. Here was Cora rejecting exactly the kind of suitor he actually was: wealthy, prominent, able to provide material security in favor of the simple, honest life she thought she was living with him. The irony was devastating. "Some women might find that appealing," he said carefully. "Then they're welcome to him," Cora replied firmly. "I'd rather have a man who carves toys for children and fixes my broken shelves because he wants to help, not because he's trying to impress me with his generosity." As she spoke, Eli accidentally knocked over his inkwell, sending black liquid spreading across his arithmetic problems. Instead of scolding him, Cora immediately moved to help clean up the mess, reassuring the boy that accidents happen and his work could be redone. Watching her, Silas realized that his deception had trapped him in an impossible situation. The woman he was falling in love with had just explicitly rejected everything he actually was in favor of the lie he was living, and the longer he maintained that lie, the more devastating the truth would be when it finally came to light. The morning after Dr. Wells's visit, Silas found himself in an increasingly precarious position. The children, unaccustomed to maintaining a careful facade, were beginning to let small details slip that painted a picture inconsistent with their supposed poverty. At breakfast, Daisy had casually mentioned their big house with the wraparound porch and the view of the mountains, only to catch herself and quickly add that she meant the house we used to visit sometimes. Eli, meanwhile, had drawn a detailed picture of what he called our old home for Cora, complete with multiple barns, extensive corrals, and a house that was clearly far grander than anything a struggling ranch hand could have afforded. When Cora admired the drawing, he'd beamed with pride and launched into a detailed description of the ranch's layout before Silas could redirect the conversation. "What an imagination your boy has," Cora said, studying the drawing more closely. "This looks like quite an estate, very detailed for something he's making up." "Children remember things bigger than they actually were," Silas said quickly. "You know how a child's memory can make a modest place seem grand." Cora nodded, but he caught her glancing between the drawing and his face with that perceptive look that had become increasingly frequent. She was putting pieces together, and Silas could feel the web of his deception beginning to fray. The situation became more complicated when Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house stopped by the shop that afternoon. She was a stern woman who rarely had anything good to say about anyone, but she seemed particularly interested in discussing the new arrivals in town. "I've been hearing interesting things about your boarders, Miss Mayfield," she said, her sharp eyes scanning the workroom where Silas was reinforcing a wooden cabinet. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that the man looked familiar, and Dr. Wells said the children spoke with unusual refinement for their supposed circumstances. "People love to gossip," Cora replied diplomatically, not looking up from her sewing. "I find it's better to judge folks by their actions rather than speculation about their past." "Oh, I quite agree," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone suggesting the opposite. "Though I did find it curious that young Eli knew so much about cattle breeding when he was helping Mr. Parker with his sick cow yesterday. Strange knowledge for a child whose father is supposedly looking for ranch work because his own place failed." Silas's hands stilled on his work. He'd sent Eli to help the elderly rancher with his ailing livestock, thinking it would be good for the boy to feel useful. He hadn't considered that Eli's extensive knowledge gained from years of living on one of the most successful ranches in the territory would raise questions about their background. "The boy has a natural way with animals," Silas said, forcing his voice to remain calm. "Some children just have that gift." "Indeed," Mrs. Henderson replied, though her expression remained skeptical. "Well, I suppose we all have our little mysteries. Good day, Miss Mayfield." After she left, the workroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. Cora continued her stitching, but Silas could sense her thinking, processing the accumulating inconsistencies in their story. "Sam," she said finally, her voice careful and measured, "is there anything you want to tell me about your past or your circumstances?" The moment hung between them like a held breath. This was his opportunity to come clean, to trust her with the truth and hope her feelings for him were strong enough to overcome the deception. But looking at her earnest face, remembering her rejection of Dr. Wells's wealth and status, Silas found himself frozen with fear. "What do you mean?" he asked, hating himself for the continued lie. Cora set down her needle and looked at him directly. "I mean that your children know things most children wouldn't know. They speak like they've had extensive education. They understand concepts about ranching and business that suggest they've been around success, not failure. And you, She paused, seeming to gather her thoughts. You work with your hands like someone who's chosen to, not someone who's had to. There's a confidence in everything you do that speaks of authority, not desperation. Silas felt his world beginning to tilt. She'd seen through their carefully constructed facade, had been observing and analyzing their behavior for weeks. The question was what she planned to do with her suspicions. Cora, I'm not asking you to explain, she interrupted gently. Everyone has reasons for the choices they make. I just want you to know that whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from or toward, it doesn't change how I feel about you and the children. The kindness in her voice nearly broke him. Here she was, offering him understanding and acceptance despite knowing he'd been dishonest with her. It was more than he deserved, and it made his deception feel even more wrong. How do you feel? He asked quietly, needing to hear the words even as he feared them. Cora's cheeks colored slightly, but she met his gaze steadily. I feel like you and Daisy and Eli have brought something into my life that I thought I'd lost forever. Purpose, laughter, the sense of being needed and valued. I feel like I'm falling in love with a man who carves horses for his son and reads stories to his daughter and fixes my shelves, not because he has to, but because he wants to take care of us. The word us hit him like a physical blow. She was including herself in their family, speaking of love and care and a future together. And all of it was built on a foundation that would crumble the moment she learned who he really was. Cora, he began again, but she held up a hand to stop him. Whatever your real name is, whatever your real circumstances are, I've seen your heart these past weeks. I've watched you with your children, seen how you treat people with kindness and respect, regardless of their station. That's the man I'm falling in love with, not some story about your past, but the reality of who you are right here, right now. Silas stood and moved toward her, drawn by the warmth in her voice and the invitation in her eyes. When he reached her chair, she rose to meet him, and suddenly they were standing close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her hazel eyes, could catch the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. You're a remarkable woman, Cora Mayfield, he said softly. And you're a man with secrets. Sam Turner, if that's even your real name, she replied. But there was no accusation in her tone, only acceptance. But secrets can't change what I see when you think no one is watching, or how your children look at you with such complete trust and love. When he kissed her, it was with the desperate intensity of a man who knew he was stealing something he had no right to claim. Her response was warm and willing, and for a moment he let himself believe that love could truly conquer all, that somehow this impossible situation could work out in everyone's favor. But even as he held her, Silas knew that the reckoning was coming. The truth had a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it was buried, and when it did, it would test everything they were building together. The morning that changed everything started like any other. Silas was helping Cora rearrange her storage room while the children played quietly in the shop's front window, building elaborate scenarios with Eli's wooden horse and a collection of carved animals that had grown as Silas found excuses to keep his hands busy during the long evenings. Cora was reaching for a bolt of fabric on a high shelf when she knocked over a small wooden box, sending its contents scattering across the floor. Silas immediately bent to help gather the spilled items, buttons, thread, spare needles, and other sewing notions, but as he reached for a paper that had fluttered under a nearby table, his heart stopped cold. It was a bank document from the First National Bank of Helena, but it wasn't one of Cora's papers. It was his quarterly statement from his business account that he'd carelessly shoved into his jacket pocket weeks ago and forgotten about. The paper clearly showed his real name, Silas Boone, and an account balance that represented more money than most people saw in a lifetime. "What's this?" Cora asked, reaching for the document before Silas could snatch it away. He watched in growing horror as her eyes scanned the paper, seeing the exact moment when comprehension dawned. Her face went pale, then flushed with what he recognized as anger and hurt. "Silas Boone," she read aloud, her voice carefully controlled. "Account balance, 47-0. She looked up at him, and the betrayal in her eyes cut him deeper than any physical blow could have. The Big Sky Ranch. I know that name it's one of the largest cattle operations in the territory. Cora, I can explain. Can you? She interrupted, her voice rising despite her obvious effort to remain calm. Can you explain why one of the wealthiest men in Montana has been living in my shop, pretending to be a broke ranch hand? Can you explain why you've let me feed you and house you and— Her voice caught, and she pressed her lips together firmly before continuing. Can you explain why you've been lying to me every single day for weeks? The children had stopped playing, their young faces turning toward the sound of raised voices with alarm. Daisy appeared in the doorway of the storage room, her green eyes wide with concern. "Papa, Miss Cora, what's wrong?" Silas's throat felt like it was closing. How could he explain this to his children, who had participated in the deception, but hadn't fully understood its implications? How could he make them understand that their father had built something beautiful on a foundation of lies? "Your papa," Cora said, her voice shaking with emotion, "has been pretending to be someone he's not. He's not Sam Turner, a poor ranch hand looking for work. He's Silas Boone, one of the richest men in the territory." Eli appeared beside his sister, clutching his wooden horse. "But Papa, you said we needed to find someone who would love us for who we are, not for our money." "I did say that," Silas replied quietly, "and I meant it." "Then why does Miss Cora look so sad and angry?" Daisy asked, her perceptive nature cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Cora knelt down to the children's level, and despite her anger, her voice was gentle when she addressed them. "Your father lied to me, sweetheart. He made me believe you were poor and struggling when you're actually very wealthy. He let me take care of you out of what I thought was kindness, when he could have afforded the finest hotel in any city." "But you did take care of us out of kindness," Eli protested. "You didn't know about the money, so it was still real kindness." The boy's simple logic made Cora's expression soften for a moment, but when she looked back at Silas, the hurt returned full force. "That's not the point, Eli. The point is that your father didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. He made me feel sorry for you, made me think I was helping a family in need, when really he was." She paused, searching for words. "He was testing me, like I was some kind of experiment." "It wasn't like that," Silas said desperately. "Cora, you have to understand." "No, I don't have to understand anything," she replied, standing and backing away from him. "I don't have to listen to more lies and excuses. I don't have to pretend that this is somehow acceptable because your intentions were good." The pain in her voice was devastating. This was exactly what he'd feared, but hearing it, seeing the way she looked at him now like he was a stranger, like everything they'd built together had been contaminated by his deception, was worse than anything he'd imagined. "Every woman who's come calling since my wife died has wanted my money," he said, his voice raw with desperation. "They looked at my children like obstacles to be managed, not human beings to be loved. I needed to know." "You needed to know what? Whether I was good enough for you, whether I passed some test you'd devised." Cora's voice cracked with emotion. "Did it ever occur to you that maybe, just maybe, an honest conversation would have served you better than this elaborate charade?" "I was protecting my children." "No, you were protecting yourself," she shot back. "You were so afraid of being hurt again that you hurt me instead. You let me fall in love with a man who doesn't exist." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Silas felt something breaking inside his chest, a pain worse than when he'd lost Sarah, because this time he had no one to blame but himself. "He does exist," Daisy said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the tension. "Papa is still Papa. He still reads us stories and makes toys and fixes things and takes care of us. The money doesn't change who he is inside." "Your daughter is very wise," Cora said softly. "But money changes everything, sweetheart. It changes how people see each other, how they treat each other. It makes it impossible to know what's real and what's just." She gestured helplessly around the room. "What's just performance?" "But you said you loved him," Eli pointed out with devastating childhood honesty. "Yesterday you said you loved Papa. Did the money make that stop being true?" Cora's composure finally cracked, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. I loved Sam Turner, the kind man who fixed my shelves and carved toys for his children and kissed me like I was precious to him. But Sam Turner was a lie. I don't know who Silas Boone is. I'm the same man, Silas said quietly. Everything you saw, everything you felt that was real. The only thing that was false was my name and my circumstances. Only. Cora laughed bitterly. Only your entire identity. Only the foundation of everything we've shared. Silas, I've been living like we were equals, like we were building something together as partners. But we were never equals, were we? You were always the rich man slumming with the poor seamstress, always in control, always able to leave whenever you got tired of playing house. That's not, isn't it? She challenged. Right now, you could walk out of here, get in your fine carriage, and go back to your mansion. You could hire a dozen nannies to care for your children, a dozen servants to run your household. You don't need me, Silas. You never needed me. This was all just some kind of elaborate game. The accusation hit him like a physical blow because he could see how it must look from her perspective. A wealthy man playing at poverty, testing her character, while risking nothing of his own. It wasn't a game, he said desperately. My feelings for you are real. The children's love for you is real. The life we've built here was built on lies. Cora finished. All of it. Every conversation, every shared meal, every moment of intimacy all contaminated by the fact that you couldn't trust me with the truth. She moved toward the door, then turned back to face him one more time. I want you to leave, Silas. All of you. Pack your things and go back to your real life, your real world. Find yourselves a wealthy widow who won't mind being tested and manipulated. Find someone who's worthy of your games. Cora, please. Go, she said firmly, though her voice broke on the word. Just go. As Silas looked at the woman he loved, seeing nothing but pain and betrayal in her eyes, he realized that his plan to protect his children from heartbreak had led them straight into the biggest heartbreak of all. They had found exactly what they were looking for, a woman who loved them unconditionally, and his deception had destroyed any chance of keeping her. The packing took less than an hour, 3 lives reduced to the same worn carpet bags they'd arrived with, though now the modest belongings felt like costumes from a play that had ended badly. Silas moved through the motions mechanically, while his children sat on the narrow bed, their faces reflecting a confusion and hurt that made his chest ache with regret. "Papa," Daisy said quietly as he folded her spare dress, "why won't Miss Cora listen when we try to explain? We're still the same people we were yesterday." "Sometimes, sweetheart, when people feel betrayed, it's hard for them to hear anything else," Silas replied, though the words felt inadequate. How could he explain to his 10-year-old daughter that love without trust was like a house without a foundation beautiful to look at, until the first strong wind brought it crashing down? Eli clutched his wooden horse, the toy that had become his most treasured possession during their time here. Is she really going to forget about us? Is she going to stop loving us because we have money? The question cut deep because Silas feared the answer. Cora's anger had been so complete, so final. She'd looked at him like he was a stranger, like everything they'd shared had been contaminated by his deception. "I don't think anyone could stop loving you two," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they care about most, and sometimes those mistakes can't be fixed." They loaded their belongings into the same wagon that had brought them to Millbrook, though this time Silas had to retrieve it from the livery stable where he'd been paying for its keep with money that supposedly didn't exist. The irony wasn't lost on Haim even. His modest transportation had been a deception. As they prepared to leave, the town seemed different. Word of the deception had spread with the speed that gossip travels in small communities. Some people watched them with curiosity, others with disapproval. Mrs. Henderson stood in her boarding house doorway with a satisfied expression that suggested she'd known all along that something wasn't right about the mysterious newcomers. Only old Mr. Parker, the rancher whose cow Eli had helped heal, approached them directly. "Son," he said to Silas, his weathered face grave, "I don't know what all this business is about, but I know that boy of yours has a gift with animals and a good heart. Don't you let whatever foolishness brought you here make you forget that what matters most is the children." "Thank you," Silas replied, shaking the old man's hand. "You're right, the children are what matter most." As they drove out of town, Silas couldn't resist one last look back at Cora's shop. She was standing in the window, her face pale and drawn. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, and he saw something in her expression that might have been regret. But then she stepped back into the shadows, and he faced forward, guiding the horses toward a future that felt as uncertain as the path they'd traveled to get here. The journey back to the Big Sky Ranch took 2.5 days, each mile weighted with silence and recrimination. The children asked few questions, seeming to understand that their father needed time to wrestle with his thoughts. At night, they made camp under stars that offered no comfort, and Silas lay awake, listening to his children's quiet breathing while fingering Sarah's ring beneath his shirt. Miguel was waiting on the porch when they arrived, his face carefully neutral as he helped unload their meager belongings. The contrast between their modest bags and the grand house behind them seemed to mock everything they'd tried to accomplish. "Patron," Miguel said quietly, "how did it go?" Silas looked at his old friend, this man who'd stood by him through Sarah's death and the difficult years that followed. "I found exactly what I was looking for, Miguel, and I destroyed it with my own hands." The children wandered through the house like ghosts, touching familiar objects with little enthusiasm. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, the fine furniture, the expensive rugs, the portraits on the walls, but it all felt hollow now. The house that had once been filled with Sarah's laughter and love now seemed like a museum to a life that no longer quite fit. That evening, Silas stood on his porch, looking out over land that stretched to the horizon, cattle that represented more wealth than most men could imagine, and a future that felt as empty as the day Sarah died. He'd thought that finding love again would fill the void in their lives, but instead, he'd managed to create an even deeper hole. "We should go back," Daisy said, appearing beside him in her nightgown, her feet bare on the wooden planks. "Sweetheart," Miss Cora was very clear about what she wanted. She was hurt and angry, Daisy said with the wisdom that sometimes surprised him. "Mama used to say that when people are hurt, they sometimes say things they don't really mean. Your mama was a wise woman, but this situation is different. I betrayed Miss Cora's trust. That's not something that's easily forgiven." Eli joined them, still clutching his wooden horse. "But you taught us that, when we make mistakes, we should try to fix them. Shouldn't you try to fix this?" The simple question hung in the night air like a challenge. What kind of example was he setting for his children by simply accepting defeat? What would Sarah think of him giving up without a fight? "Sometimes," he said slowly, "fixing a mistake requires more than just saying you're sorry. Sometimes it requires proving that you've learned from what you did wrong." "So how do you prove that?" Daisy asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment, thinking about everything that had happened, everything he'd learned about himself and about Cora during their time in Millbrook. "I suppose," he said finally, "you prove it by choosing honesty over self-protection, by being willing to be vulnerable even when it's scary." The idea that began forming in his mind was both terrifying and necessary. If he truly wanted Cora's forgiveness, if he wanted any chance of rebuilding what they'd lost, he would have to do something that went against every protective instinct he'd developed since Sarah's death. He would have to tell the truth, not just to Cora, but to everyone, publicly, completely, without reservation or excuse. Over the next several days, Silas found himself thinking constantly about a letter he could write, but didn't know how to send. How do you apologize for betraying someone's trust? How do you explain that your deception came from love, not malice, without sounding like you're making excuses? He started the letter a dozen times, crumpling each attempt and throwing it into the fire. Nothing he wrote seemed adequate to express the depth of his regret or the sincerity of his feelings. Meanwhile, the children grew increasingly listless. They picked at their meals, showed little interest in their usual activities, and spent long hours staring out windows in the direction of Millbrook. It was clear that leaving Cora had hurt them as much as it had hurt him, perhaps more. They had tasted what it was like to have a mother's love again, and its absence left them hollow. Miguel finally cornered him in the barn one evening as he was avoiding the empty house by doing unnecessary work on already perfect equipment. "Patron, you are a good man, but you are being a fool." "I'm being a realistic man," Silas replied, without looking up from the bridle he was cleaning for the third time. "I made my choice, and now I have to live with the consequences." "You made a mistake," Miguel corrected, "but the choice you make now that will define what kind of man you really are. Will you be the man who runs away when love gets difficult, or the man who fights for what matters most?" "She doesn't want to see me, Miguel. She made that very clear." "Did she? Or did she want to see if you cared enough to try again? Women, they are complicated creatures. Sometimes when they say go away, they mean prove that you will not give up so easily." Silas finally looked up at his friend. "And what if you're wrong? What if I go back and she rejects me again, this time in front of the whole town?" Miguel shrugged. "Then you will know you tried, and your children will know their father fought for love instead of hiding from it." That night, Silas sat at his desk and began writing again, but this time he wasn't writing just to Cora. He was writing a letter that would require him to lay bare his heart and his mistakes to an entire community. It was the kind of vulnerability that terrified him, but perhaps that was exactly what the situation required. As he wrote, he realized that his fear of being hurt again had caused him to hurt the very people he'd been trying to protect. His children had lost not just their chance at a mother's love, but their faith in their father's courage. And Cora had lost her trust in the man she'd opened her heart to. If he was going to fix this, he would have to risk everything: his pride, his reputation, his heart. He would have to bet everything on the possibility that love, when offered honestly and completely, might be strong enough to overcome even the deepest betrayal. The letter he finally finished was unlike anything he'd ever written, raw, honest, and terrifying in its vulnerability. It was a public confession and a private plea, an acknowledgement of his failures and a declaration of his love. All that remained was finding the courage to send it. Silas's return to Millbrook 3 weeks later caused exactly the kind of stir he'd expected. Word traveled fast in small towns, and by the time he'd hitched his horses in front of the general store, a small crowd had begun to gather. This time, he made no attempt to hide his wealth, wore his finest clothes, drove his best carriage, and carried himself with the bearing of the successful cattleman he actually was. The children sat beside him in the carriage, dressed in their good clothes, but clearly nervous about the reception they might receive. Daisy clutched a small bundle in her lap, something wrapped in brown paper that she'd insisted on bringing despite Silas's questions about its contents. "Are you ready for this?" he asked them quietly before stepping down from the carriage. "Are you?" Eli countered, his young face serious beyond his years. It was a fair question. Silas had rehearsed what he planned to say 100 times during the journey. But now that he was here, facing the curious and sometimes hostile faces of the townspeople, his carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. Dr. Wells emerged from the hotel where he'd apparently been staying, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity. Well, he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "if it isn't the mysterious Sam Turner, though I understand your real name is rather different." "It is," Silas replied, making no attempt to lower his voice. "My name is Silas Boone, and I own the Big Sky Ranch north of here. I came to your town under false pretenses, and I owe all of you an explanation." The crowd grew larger as word spread, people emerging from shops and businesses to see what all the commotion was about. Silas caught sight of Mrs. Henderson nodding with vindicated satisfaction, and Mrs. Patterson whispering urgently to her companions, but he didn't see the one face he most hoped and feared to encounter. "Miss Cora isn't here, old mister," Parker said, appearing at his elbow as if reading his thoughts. "She's been keeping to herself since you left. Barely comes out of that shop except for necessities." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He'd hoped that time might have softened her anger, but her continued isolation suggested that his betrayal had cut deeper than he'd imagined. "Then I'll speak to all of you first," he said, raising his voice to address the growing crowd. "And I'll ask that you pass along what I have to say to anyone who wasn't here to hear it." He stepped up onto the platform that served as the general store's loading dock, making himself visible to everyone gathered in the street. His heart was pounding, but his voice was steady when he began to speak. "3 weeks ago, I came to your town pretending to be something I wasn't. I told you my name was Sam Turner, that I was a broke ranch hand looking for work. Every word of that was a lie." He paused, letting the admission settle before continuing. "The truth is that I'm a wealthy man who's spent the years since my wife's death watching women pursue my fortune instead of caring about my children." A murmur ran through the crowd, some people nodding with understanding while others looked skeptical or disapproving. "I convinced myself that deceiving you was justified because I was protecting my children. I told myself that the only way to find someone who would love them for who they were, not what they might inherit, was to hide our true circumstances." His voice grew heavier with regret. "I was wrong. Dead wrong. So why are you here now?" Dr. Wells called out, his tone challenging. "Come to apologize before you go back to your mansion and forget all about us." "I'm here because I fell in love," Silas replied simply, and the crowd fell silent. "I fell in love with a woman who showed kindness to strangers, who treated my children like they mattered, who created a home out of nothing more than warmth and generosity. And I destroyed that love with my deception." He looked around at the faces in the crowd, seeing curiosity, judgment, and in some cases, sympathy. "I'm not here asking for your forgiveness, because I know some mistakes can't be undone, but I am here to tell the truth, finally and completely. Miss Cora Mayfield deserves to know that every feeling I expressed to her was genuine, even if the circumstances were false." "Pretty words," Mrs. Henderson called out, her voice sharp with disapproval. "But what good are they now? You've humiliated that poor woman, made her the subject of gossip and speculation." "You're right," Silas acknowledged, the admission costing him dearly. "I have humiliated her, and I've caused pain to someone who deserved nothing but honesty and respect. That's something I'll have to live with for the rest of my life." "Then why come back at all?" someone else shouted. "Why not just leave well enough alone?" Silas felt Daisy's small hand slip into his, her presence giving him strength to voice the truth that terrified him most. "Because my children taught me that when you love someone, you fight for them. You don't give up when things get difficult. You don't run away when you're scared." The crowd was completely quiet now, hanging on his every word. "I came back to tell Miss Cora that I love her not. Sam Turner's version of love built on lies, but Silas Boone's love, offered with complete honesty and no reservations. I came back to ask her to judge me not by my worst mistake, but by the man I'm trying to become." The crowd began to disperse after Silas's speech, some people shaking their heads in disapproval, while others seemed moved by his honesty. But Cora still hadn't appeared, and Silas felt the weight of possible failure settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. "She heard you," Mr. Parker said quietly, nodding toward the seamstress shop. "I saw her curtain move during your speech. She's been watching from her window." Hope and terror warred in Silas's chest. If she'd heard everything and still chosen not to come out, it might mean his confession had only confirmed her worst opinions of him. Or it might mean she needed time to process what he'd said before deciding how to respond. "Papa," Daisy whispered, tugging on his sleeve, "should I give this to her now?" She held up the brown paper bundle she'd been clutching throughout the journey. For the first time, Silas noticed that his daughter's careful stitching around the edges suggested she'd wrapped whatever was inside herself. "What is it, sweetheart?" "Something I made for Miss Cora while we were gone. I thought maybe if she saw it, she'd understand how sorry we are." Eli nodded solemnly. "We wanted to make something that would show her we still think about her every day." The children's simple gesture touched Silas deeply. While he'd been struggling with elaborate speeches and grand gestures, they'd been focused on the kind of heartfelt expression that had always mattered most to Cora. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said softly, "but maybe we should knock on her door properly, instead of leaving it on her doorstep. The walk to the seamstress shop felt like the longest 50 yards of Silas's life. With each step, he expected Cora to appear and tell them to leave, or to refuse to answer their knock entirely. But when they reached her door, Daisy stepped forward and rapped gently on the wood with her small knuckles. "Miss Cora, it's Daisy and Eli. We brought you something." The silence stretched long enough that Silas began to think she wouldn't respond. Then the door opened just wide enough for Cora to peer out, her face carefully composed, but her eyes red-rimmed as if she'd been crying. "Hello, children," she said softly, her gaze flickering briefly to Silas before returning to the twins. "You look well." "We miss you," Eli said with the directness that only children could manage. "Every day, the big house doesn't feel like home anymore because you're not there." Cora's composure wavered slightly. "I miss you too, both of you, very much." "We made you something," Daisy said, holding out the wrapped bundle, "to say we're sorry for the lying, and to show you that we love you no matter what." Cora accepted the package with trembling hands, her eyes never leaving the children's faces. When she unwrapped it, she gasped softly. Inside was a small quilt, clearly made by inexperienced hands, but stitched with obvious care and love. The patches were uneven, the stitching crooked in places, but the pattern told us story scenes of their time together in Millbrook rendered in fabric and thread. "We had to ask Miguel's wife to help us with the hard parts," Eli explained. "But we did most of the sewing ourselves. See, there's you in your shop, and there's Papa fixing your shelves, and there's all of us having supper together. And here," Daisy pointed to a corner patch, "is you reading to us by the fire. That was my favorite time every day." Cora's hands shook as she held the quilt, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever made for me," she whispered. "Do you like it enough to forgive us?" Eli asked hopefully. "Oh, sweetheart," Cora said, kneeling down to embrace both children. "There was never anything for me to forgive you for. You were just children following your father's instructions. The only person I was angry with was—" She looked up at Silas over the children's heads, and he saw the struggle in her eyes. The love was still there, he realized with a jolt of hope, but it was wrapped in layers of hurt and uncertainty. "I heard your speech," she said quietly, rising to her feet while keeping the children close. "The whole town heard your speech. And I don't know what to do with it." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You said all the right words, Silas. You apologized beautifully, took responsibility completely. But how do I know this isn't just another performance? How do I know that the real you won't disappoint me even more than the fake you did?" It was the question he'd been dreading and the one he most needed to answer. "You don't," he said simply. "You can't know. All I can do is promise you that I'm done hiding, done pretending to be anything other than exactly who I am. And who I am is a man who loves you so much that he's willing to risk everything, his pride, his reputation, his heart for the chance to spend the rest of his life proving he's worthy of your trust." Cora closed her eyes, and Silas could see her wrestling with the decision that would determine all their futures. When she opened them again, her gaze was steady but cautious. Proving it how? 6 months later, the morning sun painted the mountains gold as Cora stood before the mirror in what had once been Sarah's bedroom, now transformed into a space that honored the past while embracing the future. The wedding dress she wore was her own creation, simple but elegant, with delicate embroidery that told the story of their unconventional courtship in tiny stitches and careful beadwork. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy or quick. After that day in Millbrook when Silas had laid his heart bare before the entire town, Cora had agreed to let him prove his sincerity, but on her terms. She'd insisted on a slow rebuilding of trust, on getting to know Silas Boone, the wealthy rancher, as thoroughly as she'd known Sam Turner, the handyman. For 3 months, he'd courted her properly and openly, traveling the distance between the ranch and town twice weekly to sit in her parlor under the watchful eyes of the community. He'd brought her small gifts, not expensive tokens of his wealth, but thoughtful offerings that showed he understood her character. Books for her library, seeds for her garden, fine fabric for her work that came with no expectation beyond her pleasure in beautiful materials. The children had been their strongest advocates, visiting Cora regularly and gradually wearing down her defenses with their unchanged affection and their father's genuine efforts to be completely honest about everything. When Eli had fallen from a horse and broken his arm, Cora had been the first person Silas sent for, and her immediate response of dropping everything to care for the injured boy had reminded them all what truly mattered. The breakthrough had come when Cora finally visited the Big Sky Ranch and saw how Silas lived when he thought no one was watching. She'd expected ostentation and display, but instead found a home that was comfortable without being showy, a man who treated his employees with respect and fairness, and a father who clearly put his children's needs above his own comfort. He still carves toys for them every evening, Miguel's wife, Maria, had told her privately. And he reads to them just like he did in your shop. The money, it does not change his heart. But perhaps the most important moment had come when Cora discovered the memory box in Silas's bedroom, a simple wooden chest where he kept Sarah's belongings alongside mementos from their time in Millbrook. Her patchwork quilt lay carefully folded next to Sarah's letters. Eli's first attempt at whittling rested beside one of Sarah's hair ribbons, and Daisy's schoolwork from those precious weeks was preserved alongside Sarah's poetry. "You kept them," she'd said, her voice filled with wonder. "They were the happiest weeks I'd known since Sarah died," Silas had replied simply. "Even knowing how it ended, I couldn't bear to throw away the evidence that it happened." Now, as she adjusted her simple veil made from fabric left over from that first quilt she'd wrapped around the children, Cora marveled at how much their lives had changed. The wedding would be small, held on the ranch with just the closest friends and family. Dr. Wells had left town months ago, disappointed but grudgingly respectful of her choice. Mrs. Henderson still disapproved, but even she had admitted that Silas's public honesty and patient courtship showed genuine remorse for his earlier deception. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Cora?" Daisy's voice called through the door. "Papa sent us to see if you need help with anything." "Come in, sweetheart," Cora called, and both children entered, dressed in their finest clothes and beaming with excitement. "You look beautiful," Eli said solemnly, his eyes wide with admiration. "Like a princess in one of our storybooks." "Thank you," Cora replied, kneeling to embrace them both. "Are you ready to officially become my children today?" "We've been ready since the first day we met you," Daisy said with characteristic directness. "We just had to wait for Papa to figure out how to deserve you." The simple wisdom of her words made Cora's eyes mist with tears. These children had taught her as much about love and forgiveness as their father had taught her about second chances and the courage to trust again. "Is Papa nervous?" she asked, as they walked toward the main staircase together. "Very nervous," Eli reported. "He keeps checking his pocket to make sure he has the rings. And he made Miguel promise 3 times to have the horses ready if you change your mind and want to run away," Daisy added with a giggle. At the bottom of the stairs, Silas waited in his finest suit, his silver hair combed back, and his expression mixing joy with barely controlled anxiety. When he saw her, his face transformed with a smile that reached all the way to his eyes. "You're beautiful," he said softly as she approached, taking her hands in his. "More beautiful than I deserve." "You deserve happiness, Silas," she replied, meaning every word. "We all deserve happiness." The ceremony itself was simple but meaningful, held on the same wraparound porch where Silas had stood so many mornings feeling lost and alone. Miguel served as best man, while Maria stood with Cora. The children had special roles as ring-bearers, their faces glowing with pride as they participated in the creation of their new family. When the minister asked if they promised to love each other in honesty and truth, their "I do" carried the weight of everything they'd survived and overcome together. As Silas slipped the new wedding ring onto Cora's finger, she noticed that he no longer wore Sarah's ring on the chain around his neck. Instead, it now rested in the memory box upstairs, honored but no longer carried as a barrier to new love. "With this ring," he said, his voice strong and clear, I promise you my heart, my honesty, and my complete devotion for all the days of our lives." When they kissed as husband and wife, the children cheered, Miguel wiped his eyes, and the mountains themselves seemed to smile down on this family that had found its way to love through loss, deception, forgiveness, and finally, truth. Later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, Daisy curled up against Cora's side and said, "I'm glad Papa's story had a happy ending after all." "Our story," Eli corrected, settling against his father's shoulder. "This is our happy ending." And looking around at the faces of the people she loved most in the world, Cora knew that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose. And the strongest love is the kind that survives being tested and emerges even more precious for having endured.